June 19, 1944. High above the endless blue of the Philippine Sea, a lone American fighter pilot glanced down at the fuel gauge inside his Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The needle was already sliding lower than he liked. Then he looked up again. 5 Japanese fighters circled thousands of feet above him, slowly tightening their formation like birds of prey watching a wounded animal. Their silver wings flashed briefly in the sunlight before disappearing against the pale sky. His carrier was somewhere far to the east, nearly 80 miles away, hidden beyond the curve of the earth. His wingman had vanished minutes earlier during the chaos of a massive aerial battle. The radio crackled with broken voices and fragments of combat reports, but none of them were meant for him. For the moment, he was completely alone. And in that lonely patch of sky, Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vrau made a decision that would either kill him in minutes or become one of the most remarkable moments of the Pacific Air War. The summer of 1944 had brought the Pacific conflict to a decisive stage. American naval power had grown into something unprecedented in military history. Massive carrier task forces that moved across the ocean like floating airfields. Each carrier carried dozens of aircraft. Each aircraft carried bombs, guns, and young men trained to fight thousands of miles from home. The strategic goal was clear: seize the Mariana Islands, construct airfields for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers, and bring the war directly to the Japanese home islands. But between American ambition and that objective stood the Imperial Japanese Navy, still capable of delivering a devastating counterattack. The Japanese combined fleet had assembled 9 aircraft carriers and hundreds of aircraft for what its commanders believed would be the decisive battle of the war. Their pilots had trained for this moment. Their doctrine called for one overwhelming strike that would cripple the American fleet and restore control of the Pacific. American commanders knew the attack was coming. The invasion of Saipan, Operation Forger, was designed to provoke exactly such a response. By mid-June, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 waited west of the Marianas. 15 carriers, nearly 900 aircraft. It was the largest concentration of naval aviation power the world had ever seen. Yet for all that strength, carrier warfare remained deeply personal. A pilot launched from a flight deck entered a world defined by unforgiving numbers. Fuel consumption, distance to the fleet, wind direction, and the simple fact that if anything went wrong, the nearest friendly ship might be hundreds of miles away. The Pacific Ocean was vast, beautiful from above, merciless when viewed from the water. The fighters defending the fleet were Grumman F-6F Hellcats, large, powerful aircraft designed specifically to defeat the Japanese A-6M0. They were faster, heavily armored, and armed with 6 .50 caliber machine guns capable of tearing an enemy fighter apart in seconds. The Hellcat had changed the balance of power in the Pacific. But even the toughest aircraft in the world could not solve the most basic problem of naval aviation: fuel. When the tanks ran dry, the fighter became a glider descending toward an ocean that offered almost no chance of rescue. The morning of June 19, 1944 began with radar contacts. Dozens of them, then hundreds. Japanese carriers had launched a massive strike toward the American fleet. Fighter direction officers aboard the carriers began guiding Hellcats toward the incoming formations. The sky quickly filled with aircraft. What followed would become legendary. Wave after wave of Japanese bombers and fighters flew directly into American interceptors, guided by radar and coordinated by combat information centers. The result was devastating. More than 300 Japanese aircraft would be destroyed in a single day. American pilots later gave the battle a nickname that sounded almost absurd compared to its violence: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But statistics hide the human experience of combat. Inside the swirling chaos of hundreds of aircraft, pilots frequently lost sight of their wingmen and divisions. Dogfights scattered aircraft across hundreds of square miles of sky. And sometimes a pilot suddenly realized he was alone, separated, low on fuel, with enemies still circling nearby. Alex Vrau found himself in exactly that situation. Before the war, Vrau had been a college student in Indiana. He liked football. He liked airplanes. And when the United States entered the war in 1941, flying for the Navy seemed like a good way to serve his country. Nothing about him suggested he would become a famous fighter pilot. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't particularly loud or boastful, just another young American who learned to fly at exactly the moment history demanded it. Vrao earned his wings at Corpus Christi, Texas, where naval aviation instructors pushed cadets through one of the most demanding training programs in the military. Carrier pilots had to master skills that bordered on the absurd, landing an aircraft on a pitching flight deck barely longer than a football field, navigating across thousands of miles of open ocean with little more than a compass and dead-reckoning calculations, and learning, above all else, that mistakes in aviation were rarely forgiven. Training could teach procedure, but it could not teach temperament. Under fire, men reacted differently. Some froze, some panicked, some developed a strange clarity that allowed them to think even while chaos unfolded around them. Vrao belonged to that last group, though he never thought of himself that way. He simply made the decision that seemed most logical in the moment. His first combat missions came in late 1943, flying from the carrier USS Independence during operations in the Gilbert Islands. The learning curve was brutal. Japanese pilots were experienced. Their Zeros were light and agile. The Pacific Ocean swallowed many men who made the wrong decision at the wrong moment. Vrao watched friends disappear into the sea. He learned quickly. Check your fuel constantly. Check your 6 o'clock position every few seconds. Never assume the sky behind you is empty, because the enemy you don't see is usually the one who kills you. By early 1944, he had transferred to Air Group 6 aboard USS Intrepid, flying alongside some of the most experienced Hellcat pilots in the fleet. These men had survived the brutal fighting of 1942 and 1943. They understood that aggression alone wasn't enough. A pilot needed patience, discipline, and an intimate understanding of how his aircraft wanted to fight. Vrao absorbed every lesson. And on the morning of June 19th, those lessons were about to determine whether he lived or died. He launched from USS Intrepid as part of a combat air patrol and climbed to altitude west of the task force. For a time, his division stayed together. Then radar reported new contacts. More enemy aircraft. Pilots scattered to intercept different formations. Within minutes, the sky was filled with twisting dogfights. And suddenly, Vrao realized something. He was alone, 20,000 feet above the ocean. His wingman gone. His division nowhere in sight. And above him, 5 Japanese fighters turning slowly toward his position. They had the altitude advantage. They had numerical superiority. They had every tactical advantage except one. Vrao understood his aircraft. The Hellcat could not outturn the Zero, but it could dive faster. It could absorb punishment. And if flown correctly, it could dictate the terms of the fight. Those advantages meant nothing if used poorly, but used properly, they could turn a hopeless fight into a survivable one. Vrao glanced once more at the fuel gauge, then back at the 5 fighters above him. Standard doctrine said he should disengage, attempt to rejoin friendly aircraft, return toward the fleet. But doctrine assumed ideal conditions, and nothing about the sky that morning was ideal. So Alex Vrao made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal. Instead of running, he pushed the throttle forward and began climbing directly toward the enemy formation. Nothing in Alex Vrao's training manual covered what he was about to attempt. Naval aviation doctrine was built around teamwork. Pilots fought in pairs or divisions, protecting one another's blind spots and coordinating attacks against enemy formations. A single aircraft deliberately engaging 5 opponents was not considered bravery. It was considered a mistake. Yet in the moment Vrao pushed the throttle forward and began climbing, he was not thinking about doctrine. He was thinking about something simpler: energy. Altitude meant energy. Speed meant energy. And energy determined who controlled the fight. The 5 Japanese fighters above him were flying together, but they were not 5 independent threats. They were a formation, and formations had weaknesses. If he could disrupt their coordination, even for a few seconds, he might survive long enough to create opportunities. The Japanese pilots spotted him almost immediately. The lone Hellcat climbing toward them stood out clearly against the deep blue of the ocean below. Their reaction was swift and coordinated. The formation tightened and began turning toward the American fighter. They were preparing to surround him, cut off his escape routes, force him into a turning fight where the lighter Zero held every advantage. It was textbook aerial combat, and textbook behavior was predictable. Predictability meant opportunity. Vrao waited until the Japanese fighters committed to the maneuver. Then he did something none of them expected. Instead of continuing to climb, he rolled the Hellcat inverted and pushed the nose down into a steep dive. The aircraft surged forward as gravity and engine power combined. The heavy fighter accelerated rapidly, gaining speed far faster than the lighter Japanese planes could match. The nearest Zero reacted instinctively. Its pilot pulled into a tight defensive turn, trying to position for a shot. The maneuver followed Japanese fighter doctrine perfectly, but tight turns consumed energy. And energy, speed, and altitude was life in aerial combat. The other 4 Zeros followed their leader. They began turning as well, attempting to pursue the diving Hellcat. But their reaction had an unintended effect. Instead of remaining in a tight formation, they stretched into a loose line as each pilot attempted to reacquire the rapidly diving American fighter. In seconds, the coordination that had been their greatest advantage began to unravel. Vrao streaked past the first Zero before either pilot could fire. The Hellcat roared through the gap in the formation at more than 400 miles per hour. Then Vrao pulled hard on the stick. The aircraft groaned as it absorbed the crushing G-forces. His vision darkened momentarily at the edges, but the maneuver worked. The Hellcat climbed sharply and rolled back toward the enemy formation. For a brief, improbable moment, Vrao was behind them. The trailing Zero pilot was still searching the sky ahead for the American fighter. He never expected the Hellcat to appear behind him. Vrao steadied the gun sight and squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted in a synchronized roar. The Hellcat's guns were calibrated to converge at roughly 300 yards. At that distance, the firepower was devastating. Tracer rounds slammed into the Zero's engine and wing root. The Japanese fighter did not explode dramatically. Instead, it simply began to disintegrate. Panels tore loose. Smoke poured from the engine. The aircraft spiraled downward, trailing fire and debris. One enemy destroyed. 4 remaining. And Vrao's fuel gauge continued its slow, relentless drop. The surviving Japanese pilots reacted quickly. They scattered upward and outward, attempting to reset the engagement on more favorable terms. It was the correct move, but scattering meant they were no longer supporting each other. For the moment, the fight had changed. Instead of 5 coordinated attackers, Vrao faced several individual opponents attempting to regroup. Still dangerous, still deadly, but no longer impossible. The next minutes stretched endlessly. The 4 remaining Zeros climbed above him again, this time keeping greater distance. They circled cautiously, probing for weakness, trying to approach from different angles. Vrao refused to remain passive. Waiting meant surrendering the initiative. Instead, he selected the lowest of the 4 fighters and pushed the Hellcat into another dive. Altitude became speed. Speed became survival. The targeted Zero pilot noticed him almost immediately and dove away. The 2 aircraft plunged toward the ocean together, engines roaring at maximum power. The pursuit became a race. Both fighters accelerated toward the surface of the Philippine Sea, the blue water rising rapidly beneath them. But physics favored the Hellcat. The American fighter was heavier, stronger, and built to withstand high-speed dives. The Zero could not match its terminal velocity without risking structural failure. Vrao closed the distance. 400 yards. 300. He fired. The shot was difficult. The Zero jinked violently. The closing speed was enormous. But several rounds struck home. Smoke burst from the Japanese fighter's engine. Whether the damage was fatal, Vrao could not know. He had no time to watch. The ocean was approaching far too quickly. He pulled the Hellcat out of the dive at dangerously low altitude. The aircraft shuddered violently as it leveled only a few dozen feet above the waves. Behind him, the smoking Zero continued downward toward the sea. Vrao never saw it crash. He could only assume it was out of the fight. 2 confirmed victories. Possibly 3. But 3 Japanese fighters still remained somewhere above him. He climbed again, scanning the sky constantly. Fuel continued draining from the tanks. The remaining Zeros were cautious now. They had watched a single American fighter destroy members of their formation. They circled above him, waiting for a mistake. The engagement slowed into a strange and deadly dance. No shots fired, just maneuvering, watching, waiting, and every passing minute changed the mathematics of the battle. Because the Japanese pilots had fuel limits too. Their carriers lay far to the west. If they stayed too long, they might never reach home. Vrao realized something critical. He did not need to destroy them all. He only needed to outlast them. If the fight continued long enough, the Japanese pilots would face the same decision he had: fuel or combat. And fuel always won. For several minutes, the aircraft circled cautiously. Then one of the Japanese pilots made his decision. Perhaps his fuel was already dangerously low. Perhaps his ammunition was nearly gone. Whatever the reason, he turned west and left the fight. Now only 2 zeros remained. The odds were still against Vrao, but they were improving, and the battle was not over yet. The departure of the first zero changed the fight. Moments earlier, Vrao had faced 5 enemy aircraft circling above him. Now only 2 remained. The odds were still against him, but the sky felt different. The Japanese pilots were no longer confident hunters. They were cautious, uncertain, trying to understand how a single Hellcat had already destroyed members of their formation. They circled above him carefully, keeping their distance. Vrao knew they were studying him just as closely as he was studying them. Fuel continued to drain from his tanks. The carrier lay somewhere 80 miles to the east, and the ocean below offered no forgiveness if his engine began to sputter. The 2 zeros finally made their move. They approached from opposite directions. It was a classic maneuver, one designed to divide a pilot's attention and create a fatal opening. If Vrao turned toward one attacker, the other would slip into position behind him. It was a tactic that had claimed many American pilots earlier in the war. For a moment, the maneuver nearly worked. Both fighters closed rapidly. The distance between them shrank. In seconds, one of them would have a clear firing solution. Vrao had only one choice. He ignored the more distant aircraft and turned sharply toward the closest zero. A near threat was always more dangerous than a far one. The Japanese pilot tried to pull lead for his guns, but Vrao's turn tightened unexpectedly. The Hellcat's heavy frame cut through the maneuver with surprising speed. The zero overshot. Its burst of machine gun fire passed harmlessly behind the Hellcat's tail, and suddenly the positions were reversed. Now Vrao was beside him, close enough to see the sunlight glint off the zero's canopy, close enough to see the pilot turning his head in sudden realization. Vrao fired. The 6.50 caliber machine guns roared again. At that distance, the result was immediate. Rounds tore through the zero's engine and fuselage. The aircraft shuddered violently. Then it pitched forward and dropped toward the sea. No explosion, no dramatic fireball, just the abrupt mechanical death of a fighter whose engine had been destroyed. 3 enemy aircraft eliminated. The final zero pilot had seen enough. He had watched his formation collapse, watched 3 companions disappear from the sky, and now he faced a single American fighter that had somehow survived the impossible. He banked sharply away and dove toward the western horizon. There would be no final duel. The fight was over. For the first time since the engagement began, Vrao found himself alone in the sky. 5 enemy fighters had circled above him only minutes earlier. Now there was nothing but empty blue air. The victory brought no feeling of triumph, only relief. His hands trembled slightly on the controls. The fuel gauge reminded him that the battle was not truly finished yet. He was still 80 miles from home. Vrao turned the Hellcat east. The compass needle steadied. Below him, the Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction. He navigated by dead reckoning, scanning the ocean for any sign of the fleet. Minutes passed slowly. Every small vibration in the engine made him wonder if the fuel would run dry before he reached safety. Then finally he saw them. Thin white lines across the water. Ship wakes. Task Force 58. The carrier USS Intrepid appeared soon afterward, its gray deck cutting through the blue ocean like a floating runway. Vrao joined the landing pattern and brought the Hellcat down carefully. The aircraft rolled across the deck and came to a stop. When the canopy slid open, the young pilot climbed out slowly. Deck crews gathered around the fighter, inspecting the aircraft and asking the inevitable question. How many? Vrao held up his fingers. 3. The photograph taken in that moment, his hand raised beside the Hellcat, would later become one of the enduring images of the Pacific War. But in the instant itself, Vrao was simply exhausted and grateful to be alive. The Battle of the Philippine Sea marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation during what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot crippled the Imperial Navy's ability to project air power. Aircraft could be replaced. Pilots could not. The men lost that day represented years of experience and training that Japan could never recover. From that moment forward, American carrier aviation held overwhelming superiority in the Pacific skies. For Alex Vrao, the battle became the defining moment of his career. He continued flying combat missions through the remainder of the war, adding to his victories until he finished with 19 confirmed aerial kills, making him one of the Navy's leading aces. After World War II, he remained in naval aviation. He flew during the Korean War. He spent decades helping train new generations of fighter pilots. But when he spoke about combat later in life, his tone was never triumphant. He did not glorify killing. He did not deny fear. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, about preparation, about the men who did not come home. The engagement against 5 Zeros remained in his memory not as a moment of heroism, but as a moment of clarity. Everything he had learned, training, discipline, understanding his aircraft, had come together in a single decision. The numbers said he should run, but instinct said something else. And sometimes the only way to survive a fight is to turn toward it. 80 miles from his carrier, 5 enemy fighters circling above. No support, no margin for error. The ocean below offered no answers. The sky above offered no mercy. Only the man in the cockpit could decide what happened next. And on that morning in June 1944, Alex Vrao chose to fight. And sometimes, in war, the only way home is straight through the enemy.